Hello, everyone, and welcome back to The Beatles Forever. In our last episode, we finished the book Beatles 66, The Revolutionary Year. It was a good source of information, and we found out more about the Beatles and their personalities by the things that they did when they had a break away from each other. The winner was Paul McCartney. I'm going to see what we can find out from the book Paul McCartney, A Beating Heart by Henry Spencer, written in 2024. I also had some viewers that wanted to see stories about people in the world of the Beatles, and I thought about that, and it would be interesting to see how they interacted with the Beatles, and we'll get an outside perspective, which is neat. And I'll do that once we finish the book on Paul McCartney. So let's see what we can find out today. Paul McCartney was born June 18, 1942, in Liverpool, England. The city was trying to recover from World War II and its devastation. Young Paul grew up in a modest household. His father, James, or they called him Jim McCartney, he was a cotton salesman and a self-taught pianist who led his own jazz band in the 1920s. Paul's mother was Mary Patricia McCartney, and she was a midwife, and she had a steadfast nature and gave a sense of stability in that post-war era. The post-war life was a bit rough, and rationing was a part of life. The McCartney family and their neighbors had to make do with less. Paul said that I always think that the war and the tough times brought out the best in that generation. During this time, Liverpool and its musical heritage gave Paul a lot of inspiration. There was a skiffle craze of the 1950s, and this was a blend of jazz, blues, and folk. And it was accessible music, and all the young people were into it. Paul lost his mother to breast cancer in 1956. Paul was only 14. It left a void in his life, and music was a way for him to cope. It helped connect him to his mother and express emotions that words alone couldn't capture. Paul's father had a record collection ranging from classical to big band, and that helped him to develop his musical taste too. It was at this time that Paul met John, and they bonded in their passion for music and rebellion. They both lost their mothers at an early age, and they went on to form the Quarrymen, the World's, and this would evolve into the Beatles. Liverpool in Paul's teenage years rebuilt itself and reinvented itself. The Mersey beat scene was emerging, and there was optimism and possibility in the air. There was always music in the McCartney household. Jim would play the piano and the trumpet serenades, and now we could see where Paul got his love of music from and his talent. In this home, music wasn't background noise. It was a central pillar of family life. It was Paul's constant companion. The McCartney family wasn't wealthy, but they had plenty of love and laughter. Paul's mother, Mary, was the heart of the home, and Jim filled the family home with the sounds of the big band and ragtime, helping in his son's musical journey. The living room became the stage with Paul at the piano. His voice would fill the room with melody. His father would listen intently, his foot tapping along, and he would keep a poker face, challenging Paul to try harder and reach further. Paul got that creative spark, and it would never leave him. One day when Paul was at the piano and he played the melody that would turn into the song When I'm 64, Jim had a broad smile and said, "Son, you've done it." And Paul later said, "Those early days of the piano were more than just practice. They were the first steps on a path that led me to where I am today." And I think Dad would be pretty stunned to see how far that tune has traveled. The year 1957 was the one in which he met John Lennon at the church fete. Paul had his guitar, and he played John a rendition of Eddie Cochran's 20 Flight Rock. Paul later admitted that he was trying to show off. John at this time had his group, the Quarrymen, a skiffle group. And when Paul came on board, the group's sound began to evolve, moving away from the skiffle's jangly rhythms toward the richer, more complex textures of rock and roll. George Harrison, who would later join the band thanks to Paul persuading John, said, "Looking back, you could say we were building the foundations of the Beatles without even knowing it." They spent their days practicing and their evenings playing at the local venues, developing their crafts and developing a style of their own. John and Paul started to write their own material. Paul said, "We were just a couple of kids, but we were serious about our music." Paul McCartney had been gifted a trumpet by his father, but Paul realized he wanted to sing and play at the same time, so he traded the trumpet in for a guitar. The only guitar that he could buy was a right-handed one, so Paul had to restring the right-handed guitar so he could play left-handed. Paul's peers saw the passion Paul had for the guitar, And George Harrison said he was impressed by Paul's dedication. He'd be there working out the chords and riffs, always trying to get better. It was obvious he was going places. Paul and his bandmates would meet at his home, and the rehearsals were around the piano. One time Paul and John were working on a song, She Loves You, and Jim suggested they change the lyrics from yeah, yeah, yeah to yes, 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 thinking it would be more proper. And Paul laughed at the memory. Dad thought yeah was too American, but She Loves You, yes, 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 didn't have the same ring to it. And then Jim McCartney would listen to Paul's compositions, offering a nod of approval or a suggestion here and there. Paul said he didn't push me, but he'd let me know when I was on to something good. Next up in the book was when the group, now called the Beatles, went to Hamburg. They had a transformation there. They changed their hairstyles, their repertoire expanded, and they became more polished in their performances. Paul said, "We went there as boys and we came back as men." The years 1960 to 1962 had the Beatles cutting their teeth in the gritty clubs of Hamburg, Germany. 1962 to 63 was a period when the Beatles started to take off. They became Liverpool's top act, and they performed at the Cavern Club. And this is where the Beatlemania began. Teenage girls would gather outside the venues, trying to get a look at John, Paul, George, and Ringo. And this was a whirlwind time for the Beatles. They released the song Love Me Do in 1962, and it was a turning point for the band. Paul's bass playing was evolving during this period. He put on a melodic approach to the bass guitar. At that time, Paul said he was listening to a lot of Motown, a lot of soul, and that stuff had a big influence on how I played. His playing showed in songs like All My Loving and I Want to Hold Your Hand. Paul said the early days were like a blur, but what a fantastic blur it was. In 1962, Stu Sutcliffe died. He was the original bassist for the Beatles. He was an artist, but he joined the Beatles because of his friendship with John. He decided to quit after they finished their Hamburg gig. He had met a German girl there, and he decided to stay with her and to go back to his art. He wasn't really that great a musician. The book states that Stuart Sutcliffe's passing left a void in the band emotionally and musically. His death was a shock to the group, but it brought them together. Paul wanted to honor his memory by pushing forward with their music, and Stu was called the fifth Beatle. The book made it sound like Paul was so inspired by Stu and that they needed to carry on even without him around anymore. At the time that Stuart died, he wasn't in the Beatles anymore. And George and Paul, I had heard, felt jealous of Stu because he was John's age and they spent a lot of time together. I think if Paul was saying these things about Stu and that the band should keep going on, he was probably worried that John would want to quit after Stu died. The book stated that Paul's onstage presence was a key part of the Beatles' appeal. He had an easy banter and natural charm, and it endeared him to his fans, and his vocal performances were powerful and emotive. George Harrison said that Paul had a way of connecting with the audience. He flashed that smile, and they'd be putty in his hands. Offstage, Paul's influence extended to the band's image and business decisions. He dealt with the managers and record executives, ensuring that the Beatles' interests were protected. John said Paul had a good head for that stuff. He kept us on track. I was thinking later he didn't really like Paul butting him, so this is kind of funny. In 1963, the Beatles' fame skyrocketed with the release of Please Please Me. Paul said, "We're just doing what we loved," and suddenly everyone seemed to love it too. It was a year that they toured, had television appearances, and recording sessions. The friendship between the band members helped them navigate the madness of Beatlemania. Paul said, "We had each other's backs. That's what got us through the madness." Paul and John had a rivalry, and when one would write a song, the other had to do a song even better. At that time, they had marathon writing sessions, often holding up in the hotel rooms or at each other's homes, guitar in hand, writing the next big chart topper. 1965 and 1966 were a whirlwind of back-to-back tours, and Paul loved the spotlight. Well, they might have loved the spotlight at first, but the non-stop pace of life on the road came with its own trials. The band had to go from city to city, stuck in hotel rooms and limousines. Paul said, "We were in this together, four lads against the world," and their togetherness kept them grounded around all the chaos. They would crack jokes and tease each other, and it was their way of coping with the craziness. They were in the papers all the time, and during this time Paul got into the avant-garde art scene in London. He mingled with poets, painters, and musicians. Paul had his relationship with Jane Asher. He said she was a grounding force, and she reminded me that there's life beyond the screaming bands. In 1965, the year was one of high heights. They had songs like Yesterday and Help. And Paul was surprised when Yesterday became popular. He said, "It's a lovely melody, but it was just me and a guitar, quite different from what we had been doing." Jane Asher, she was Paul's inspiration for songwriting, and songs about her were "I'm Looking Through You" and "You Won't See Me." The years 1967 and 1968, the Beatles showed their maturity musically. The studio was their laboratory. Ringo said that Paul was our musical encyclopedia. He'd come in with a Bach piece one day and a Beach Boys track the next, all excited about what we can learn from them. And this year they were really becoming diverse, and Paul said, "We're listening to everything from classical to R&B." In 1968, the White Album came out, and there was tension in the band at this time. Paul said we had our differences, but when it came to the music, we were still on the same page. During the trying times, Paul was trying to keep the group together. He wanted to keep making music with the Beatles. Paul said it wasn't the easiest time, but in the end, we created something unique, something that only the four of us could have made together. So I will end the video here. I have found a few quibbles about this book. The author made Paul take center stage, and it seemed to show everyone giving Paul compliments. And the book just seems to skip over things going on at that time. And then there are other times that I find out things that I hadn't heard before. So the author also seems to bounce back and forth on certain topics. So I had to try to keep it on the topic at hand and put the material with each other. So in this one video, we've gotten near the end of the Beatles years already. And next we'll see Paul after his time with the greatest band in rock and roll. I don't think this is one of the better books about Paul and the Beatles. We see the band together through rose-colored glasses at times, and Paul seems to be the superhero of the band. But that's okay, because I've seen books that aren't too nice to the Beatles. I think the book is worth having an adventure in, and we'll see another side of the Beatles and Paul McCartney and the author's perspective. So we'll keep covering books, good and bad, and see what gems we can find in them. I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you did, if you could give it a thumbs up, it'll help my channel out. I hope everybody's been having a good day, and tune in again soon for another episode of the Beatles Forever. Thank you. Bye.